Well, thank you for that warm welcome. Thank you for inviting me and for choosing an unusual aspect of the subject for my talk this evening. I must say that when this centenary came up, it began to loom about 2 or 3 years ago, I thought to myself, well, at least I'm going to be let off having to give a lecture about Magna Carta, because I don't know anything about it. And I suddenly realized when this suggestion was made that I talk about this subject, that I actually did know a little bit about it, and that I could shed, I think, a little bit of unconventional light on the document and its historical importance. And I should say as well, thank you for coming this evening. My title comes from a book by Sellar and Yatesman called 1066 and All That, which is a popular skit on conventional history textbooks, which was originally published in 1930. It's one of those many examples of humour to emerge, paradoxically, from the First World War. Both of them served in the trenches, both were wounded, and they brought a sort of spirit of reactionary levity out of that dreadful experience. In the book, they covered 2,000 years of English history, including what they call Magna Carta. Actually, that name was, I think, stumped the Prime Minister, didn't he, when he was asked about this? He obviously didn't do the classical course at Eton. They paraphrase its contents by suggesting these clauses that appear on the PowerPoint. That nobody was to be put to death save for some reason except for the common people, and so on. Everyone should be free except the common people. Everything should be of the same weight and measure throughout the realm except the common people. And they've caught the language of the Charter rather well. And finally, this wonderful statement that the barons should be tried by a special jury of other barons who would understand. And presumably let them off, right. What lay behind that parody was the historical education that Sellar and Yatesman received in their public schools before the First World War and at Oxford between 1919 and 1922. They were taught that Magna Carta marked an early stage in the development of democracy. According to the Whig interpretation of history, which was a dominant influence on historical thinking, English history was a slow but inexorable progress away from autocratic monarchy and towards parliamentary government. This great historical movement flowed through the baronial rebellions against John, hence Magna Carta, against Henry III, led by Simon de Montfort, against Edward I, led by pretty well everybody, against Edward II, resulting in his deposition and murder, to go on into modern history through Elizabeth's parliaments, the Civil War of the mid-17th century, the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the Reform Acts, to arrive at the constitutional monarchy of Victoria and the parliamentary rule under Gladstone and Disraeli. Now, that account, that sort of progressive, optimistic, very nationalistic account of history, was immensely powerful and influential. And you can see echoes of it in the current comments about Magna Carta. A certain amount of rather smug self-congratulation about the about the good sense and the moderation of the English people, and a search for rather simple connections between the world of Runnymede in 1215 and our preoccupation with human rights. Sellar and Yatesman were hinting at a serious point, that Magna Carta was the product of the narrow, selfish ambitions of the barons, who were seeking concessions and privileges from a king whose financial demands and arbitrary actions were threatening them. They masqueraded behind general principles, but they had no concern for the common people. Historians writing later in the 20th century agree essentially with Seller and Yeatman. They would never say that, but the line they take is very much in tune with Seller and Yeatman's emphasis on the self-interest of the barons in 1215. They see Magna Carta, the modern view would be to see Magna Carta as a short-term attempt to resolve particular political problems. It arose out of the forceful kingship of Henry II, John's crisis of failed war against France, trouble with the Scots, quarrels with the Pope and with the Church. All these things requiring constant demands for money, which of course impinged on his subjects. The idea of Magna Carta was to head off an all-out civil war, but it provoked conflict, and the clumsy device of the security clause, which set up a committee of 25 barons who were supposed to keep the king on the straight and narrow. This was clumsy and it didn't work. The barons were looking after themselves. They had no broad vision. There's a rather cruel critic of that, the earlier view of the period in someone commenting on Stubbs's interpretation of Simon de Montfort, who was active in the middle of the 13th century. He suggested that for Stubbs, de Montfort was Gladstone in armour. Well, put that on one side, though. Of course, poorly thought out, short-term political manoeuvres can have larger unintended consequences. I was tempted to mention the devolution of government in Scotland, but I won't say any more. You can all think of your own examples. Seller and Yeatman were correct. If we look at the real chapters of Magna Carta, rather than the ones they invented, critically, you can see how the more cynical view, if you like, of baronial motives can be seen. If I move from the parody to the real thing, so to speak, I've picked out 3 chapters. The first one of this, chapter 20, says that a free man shall not be amerced, that means fined, made to pay money, usually in the context of a court, except in accordance with the degree of the offence, and for a serious offence he shall be amerced. Amerced a lot, of course. So the penalty, if you like, should suit the crime. And then it says, saving his livelihood. That means that he should not be deprived of his livelihood. The financial penalty should not be sufficient to ruin the free man. And so it goes on to be more specific, and it says that a merchant likewise should pay amercements, saving his merchandise. In other words, he wouldn't be fined, so that he has to sell all his merchandise and his business is ruined. And then finally, a villain shall be amerced, saving his wainage. And by wainage, the Charter means the means by which the peasant cultivates the land. So you can't fine a peasant so grievously that he has to sell his plough or his oxen or his seed corn and ruin himself. But notice that it says after that, if they fall into our mercy, in other words, if they get into trouble in the king's courts, the king can promise not to amerce unreasonably people who come before his own courts. This, at first sight, looks like a generous gesture on behalf of the villeins, that is, the unfree peasants. They were not to be forced to sell their ploughs and so on. However, it only applies to the king's amercements, as I've just pointed out. The barons could amerce as they wished, and the barons' court amerced many more villeins than did the king's courts. And their motive was probably not to help the villeins, but to protect them from royal demands so that they were not prevented from paying their rents and doing their labour for their lords, so that it was a measure apparently aimed to help villeins, but really helping their lords. In the same way, the next one, no vill or man shall be forced to build bridges. This is the normal way of managing public works in the Middle Ages, to order villages or towns to carry out road repair or bridge work at their own expense. And what this is saying, that this can only be done when it is involves people who ought to do so by custom and law. So some restriction is being put on the demands that can be made of local communities to carry out these public works on bridges, and I suspect the main purpose is because the barons are worried that the labour of their tenants is being diverted for doing public works rather than working for their lords. And finally, a very famous, perhaps one of the most famous chapters in Magna Carta, no free man shall be taken or imprisoned or diseased or outlawed or exiled or in any way ruined, nor will we go or send against him except by the lawful judgment of his peers or the law of the land. This applies to free men, and that gives us many problems, because it's obvious in Magna Carta that free man sometimes means an aristocrat, a privileged man. But on other occasions it does seem to be more general and includes free peasants and townspeople. Villains, of course, could be evicted. They fell outside the law. They were not free men, so they could lose their land. But again, the barons were mainly concerned with the seizure of their property by the king. They were worried about high-profile cases like that of Geoffrey de Mandeville, who fell foul of John in 1213 to 1214. That was their concern. It was the demands being made of them and the possibility that their property would be taken away. But in framing a law to protect themselves or the highest status people, they were inevitably introducing a principle which sometimes might help the lower orders. People have suggested that it's the hand of Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, that we can see behind that general principle which might sometimes apply to people who are not barons. Finally, I must say, not finally, but in looking at the relevance of these documents, these grants of privilege to the lower orders of society, I ought to say something about the Forest Charter of 1217, which was of more direct relevance to the common people than Magna Carta itself. Forest law was a problem for peasants because the forest, not a huge area covered by trees, but an area where the king reserved the hunting to himself, could include many villages. And thousands of peasants, indeed tens of thousands of peasants, were restricted in their activities under forest law. They were prevented from or fined for clearing land, for felling trees, for enclosing pasture, or simply denied access to pasture in the forest. And it exposed them to financial penalties, like chemenage, a payment on carts passing through the forest. So the 1217 Charter promised some removal of pieces of land from the force of forest law. It promised a shrinkage to some extent in the size of the forest, but it also set limits to the power of forest officials, and that would have been welcomed by peasants. But of course it was the lords who complained about forest law most vociferously, and the Forest Charter was responding to their criticisms, though I suppose you could say that if a peasant was helped by removal of some of the restrictions of forest law, that was good for barons, because then they could increase their rents. Sorry, you'll be thinking that I'm very cynical, but this is the only, I think, possible interpretation. Magna Carta was known as a Charter of Liberties, but a liberty means a privilege. It was granted to an elite, and a Charter of Liberties did not make everyone free. In the long run, Magna Carta had a wide-ranging influence on the whole of society. The ideas that lay behind Magna Carta took political and social relationship down avenues that were not expected or anticipated in 1215. Magna Carta used inclusive language. The clause setting up, I described it as a politically inept clause, setting up a committee of 25 barons to enforce the king's observance of the charter. That clause envisaged a general oath which set up a commune, a community of the realm, a sworn association of free men, which could well have included other people other than the highest aristocracy. And both before and after 1215, in political, in legal documents, phrases like the common profit and common liberties were mentioned. In 1237, the nobles, in dispute with Henry III, said that they represented the community of the realm. And they believed that when they consented to a grant of taxation, they were consenting on behalf of their tenants. So there was an element of consent from below as well as from the very top people in society. And there were intellectuals in the period around 1215 or just before who were putting forward ideas which emphasise the involvement of everybody in the political world. The best example, and an obvious one to mention in this place, John of Salisbury, one of the foremost intellectuals of the 12th century, put forward an organic analogy for an unequal but interlocking society. He compared the kingdom to a human body. You've all heard the phrase body politic. Well, it was really from John of Salisbury that we owe this idea. The king was the head, the knights were the hands. I won't go on with every part of the body which he names, but the important one is at the end. The peasants are the feet, obeying the rest of the body, inferior, lower down in the body, but nonetheless essential to sustain the whole body. Take the feet away and the person collapses. So there was this idea of an inclusiveness of people making a contribution at all social levels. So I think that those ideas lie behind some of the thinking that went into Magna Carta and the political developments that followed. I just want to make another point about the widespread of knowledge of Magna Carta. and the ideas it contained. I suspect other speakers have already said this to you, so I'll say it fairly briefly, but I still think it's a very important point to bear in mind. We have to see it, the 1215 document, the one that you at Salisbury preserve so proudly in your archives. That 1215 document has to be seen as a series of published documents. Of course, the word publication is almost anachronistic. It's irrelevant to the 13th century. But when we know that they made at least 21 copies of the 1215 Charter and distributed it around the shires and instructed sheriffs to read it in public, here was an idea of making a public knowledge of the content of the document. They did the same with the Charter of the Forest, and I'm sure, as you know, the Charter was constantly reissued and repeated and of course changed. It changed in details in 1217, in 1225. Some people say that the 1225 Charter is much more important than the 1215 one, but I shouldn't say that in Salisbury because I don't think you have a 1225 one. You have the 1215 one. It was reissued again in 1297. It was ordered to be read in churches in 1254 and 1279. It was ordered to be read in the county courts in 1265 and in 1300. More than 100 copies of one version or another have survived unto the present day. I mean, that's an extraordinarily large number, considering the hazards of fire and loss and damp and so on. And sometimes we know that copies existed until relatively recently. In the 19th century, the archives of the little town of Appleby had a copy, so it was very widespread in small places as well as large. I always say that by 1300, no one lived more than 20 miles away from a copy of Magna Carta. And you could say, well, it was in Latin, so what was the point of that? And the answer is, of course, that there were translations into French, which was a very commonly understood language in the 13th century, and it was expounded, I think, in English. I think when a sheriff read out Magna Carta, he explained its contents to the non-Latinate people who were listening. You could say this is only relevant, that the wide distribution of the Charter was only relevant for a small minority of politically important people. You needed to be educated, literate, closely connected with literate people to appreciate its contents. I can attempt an estimate of the numbers of people who were directly affected by Magna Carta, for whom it had a particular significance. This is partly based on David Carpenter's calculations, but I've refined them a bit. 12 earls, 100 barons, 300 to 400 people who were tenants of the crown, 5,000 men who you could call knights. In the church, 17 bishops, about 100 important abbots, and a few thousand important clergy, monks, cathedral clergy, rectors. In all, I work out this to be about 10,000 people. Perhaps, if you include their wives and children, perhaps 30,000 people. That is 1% of the population. Below them, there are about 3 million people, of whom about 250,000 lived in towns, about 250,000 lived in towns, and the rest on the land. So, and of those 2 3/4 million rural people, about half of them were free, and the other half were villeins or bondmen. It's important to notice that although the ultra-rich, hugely powerful barons took the lead in 1215, there was also a numerous body of officials and lesser aristocrats, the knights I've already mentioned, who did important jobs in the shires and in the courts. As jurors, you see them county by county negotiating with John before 1215. For example, to persuade him that the best person to be sheriff, the most important royal official in each shire or county, should be a local person, not some crony of the king imposed on them. Or they argued and secured a reduction in the area under forest law. They had a direct interest in Magna Carta. Some of the chapters affected them, like when a knight took over his lands, he had to pay a fee of £5, and that was limited by Magna Carta. It couldn't be above that figure. You can see them expressing their views at the national level by pressurizing barons and sometimes in meetings with the king. If local knights and gentry had a place in government and wielded influence, they were part of political society. Perhaps you can see at least the beginnings of similar trends bringing in people below the ranks of the knights and the gentry. I will just introduce you, before looking at their political role, to the circumstances and way of life of the common people. It's relatively easy to imagine people living in the larger towns being politically active. London appears in Magna Carta, and John arrived simultaneously at the time of Magna Carta with an agreement with London. But many towns in the 1190s and soon after 1200 received charters which gave them rights of self-government, so that towns like Winchester, Bristol, Gloucester and so on ran their own finances and legal system. The top townsmen were wealthy, literate, capable, articulate people. But can we envisage peasants, the great majority of the 3 million common people, having a role in government or developing political consciousness? We know a lot about them because their lords and the state recorded their names and details of their activities and of their wealth, or their material circumstances, I should say. Let me just pick a couple of examples. A survey of about 1200 of the village of South Wraxall, near Bradford on Avon, records 17 tenants, 17 people living there. A well-off individual had 45 acres of land. Most, 12 of them, had 10 or 15 acres. We know their names. Walter Elwey had 10 acres of land. He paid 4 shillings in rent, and he was expected to do ploughing services, carrying services. That means he owned a plough and owned a cart and had horses and oxen. He did haymaking services, so he was a person with some material substance. We calculate that a family could live on 10 acres of land. But life became a lot easier because they also owned animals. And we get an idea of the quantity of livestock that they held by looking at the records of the tax collected in the reign of John's son, Henry III, in 1225. For example, the Wilton Abbey's manor of Berwick St. John, again in Wiltshire, had 25 taxpayers, some with very small numbers of animals. Juliana the widow had 1 cow, but most had more. Geoffrey White had a mare, 2 cows and 8 sheep. And the relatively wealthy John Cook owned 6 oxen and 60 sheep. The cows were for subsistence. They provided milk and cheese for the peasant family. Oxen provided the draft, and the horses provided draft power for farm work. The sheep provided a commercial profit from the sale of wool, and that means that peasants were going to market and coming back with money which they could use to pay their rent, but they might have a bit to spare to spend. If you like to believe that peasants were utterly miserable, desperately poor, starving and living a hopelessly depressed life, then you ought to think about the houses that they lived in, of which we have some evidence. Those are houses excavated at Gomaldon. These are the foundations of houses excavated at Gomaldon in this fair county of Wiltshire. And that is the early 13th century phase. This is one house, you see, which starts off small, gets bigger, gets more complicated, and even more complicated through the 13th century. So these are 4 phases on the same house site. And this one here is the early 13th century phase. So the people who lived in that house were living at the time of Magna Carta. And what you need to notice is that these houses have foundations, well-established foundations, which still survive into the late 20th century. They would have had a substantial timber framework, a timber superstructure, and the timbers in particular would have been built by specialist craftsmen who would have been employed by the peasants. And we find scattered among these houses evidence of pottery, things like horseshoes, which they clearly bought, presumably in local markets. Let me just... Sorry? It's 10 metres. So, sorry, I should have said something about their size. So this house is about 30 feet long, and it's about 12, 14 feet wide. So it's small, but it's as you see, the farm becomes quite complicated with barns and outhouses and so on, and it's quite substantially built. And my next slide is to show this is a slightly later date, but the principle of a stone foundation and these rather well-made timber frames, these crucks, were apparently being used at Gomaldon. And then one last point about the material evidence. This is a reconstruction of the Yorkshire village of Warren Percy in the late 12th century. And of course in the foreground we have the splendid church, and then in the background the village with the houses of the type that I've just been describing. They're a little bit larger there. They're more like 45 feet long rather than 30 feet long. And you could get a sense there of the community, which is such an important dimension of peasant life. These people are living together in one group of buildings. They're cultivating land which lies behind the houses, which you can't see in that picture. And of course, their focus of their community life is the church, where they meet to worship and where they hear ideas. You know, these are people who are not just living a material life. The sermons, for example, are an important link between the peasantry and the world of learning. Peasants were part of the kingdom. They were well aware of the king. His image came on the coins that they used. They attended a court once a year, the View of Frankpledge, which was a royal court designed to impose law and order. The markets they attended were licensed by the king. I like to think that the peasants of Gomaldon would have heard stories about what was going on in the palace of Clarendon, not very far away from them. The king could require military service. He could expect peasants to contribute to public works, as we just heard. He expected them to levy, to accept levies of direct taxation of the kind that I've talked about in 1225. John was very short of money, constantly demanding money, particularly from his greater subjects. But of course, his greater subjects got their money from the peasants. So if a baron was asked to pay £100, he was then asking large numbers of lesser people to pay a shilling or 2 shillings or whatever, which would helped him to collect that sum. This illustration are the nightmares of Henry I. In 1130, Henry I went to bed and had 3 dreams. I'm recounting this as if it's the truth. It wasn't recorded until some years after he died, and there may be a sort of mythical element in this. But anyway, he had a nasty night with 3 nightmares, and he was visited by the representatives of the 3 sections of society. The workers, the peasants, who turn up with their scythes and their spades and so on, and with a list of grievances, probably referring to his demands for money. And then you see the knights turning up with their weapons, looking extremely threatening. And then the clergy came, and we're then told that the King Henry I leapt out of bed and seized his sword to defend himself against these aggressive enemies. But the point of that first picture is to show that there was a consciousness in the generation before Magna Carta that the king had a relationship with the peasants, and that they could grumble to him, in a dream at least, about their ill treatment. They make a contribution to government. This needs to be said that they, for example, when that 1225 subsidy was granted, that taxation was collected, and Juliana the widow had to pay a tax on her cow, that decision was made by a jury of local peasant people, of local villagers. They were expected to assess their neighbours. The key officer in the village was the reeve, an officer of the Lord, but he also had duties to the state, to attend courts and so on. Peasants were expected to maintain law and order. If a crime was committed, a village was supposed to raise the hue and cry. That is a sort of policing measure whereby the offended person, someone who had goods stolen, who had been assaulted, would shout, summon the neighbours, and chase the criminal, and hopefully capture him or her. But if they didn't have a hue and cry, they had to pay a collective fine. In other words, they were forced to, or they were pressurised into policing themselves. Justice was in everyone's interest, but of course it was also a source of profit, and the king, of course, benefited from money collected during the course of the enforcement of the law. All adult males were required to swear an oath at the age of 12 not to commit crimes and to be loyal to the king. And in an extraordinary episode in 1209, King John, who was threatened with excommunication, demanded that all men, all free men again, to swear an oath of allegiance. And this seems to have included a very large number of people who were not just barons and knights. According to John Maddicott's calculations, about 200,000 people gathered to swear that oath in person. You see the king seeing himself as the head of a unified state where he could call on the loyalty of all of his subjects. And it wasn't just a matter of the king demanding and the subjects obeying. The king extended the protection of his legal system over free tenants. This was under Henry II, John's father. If a baron's tenant was dispossessed, his land was taken away from him, he could take his grievance to the king's court. the case was once heard by the Baron's Court, which amazingly always found in favour of the Baron. But the king was extending his jurisdiction. He was, to use the modern phrase, growing the state and also increasing his revenues. The king also gave protection to those many tenants whose ancestors had once lived on royal manors. So if a lord, a baron, say, or a monastery, which had a piece of land which had once belonged to the king, tried to raise the rents, the tenants could appeal to the king for his protection. Of course, much of the king's protection was only available to free tenants. So about half of our 3 million lesser subjects, our 3 million common people, were unfree. They were known as villeins and bondmen and so on. And they were judged in the Lord's court, not in the royal court. They didn't have access to the king's court. But a strict definition of the words free and unfree was still in progress in the early 13th century. The king's court heard a number of cases in which people claimed to be free and tests were applied. Had his father or grandfather been unfree? Was he liable to pay a marriage fine? That is, when his daughter was married, did he have to pay a fine to the Lord? Had he served as reeve, because the reeve's job was thought to be appropriate for a villain? If the answer was yes, then he was judged to be unfree and not eligible to have access to the king's court. But the people kept on coming. They kept on appealing for help from the royal courts. They had great faith in them. They realized that the king's authority had the potential to override the private power of lords. And so the king was potentially a great protector. The lords were short of money as well in the early 13th century. They found ways of collecting more money, increasing court revenues, demanding more rents from their tenants, and particularly from the vulnerable villains who could not appeal for help to the king, to the common law. And you find such cases in John's reign, but they persist through the 13th century, cases when someone, this is an example from Buckinghamshire, where a man called John de Keendall detained Roger de la Dun in prison and took 7 quarters, that's 3 or 4 cartloads of corn, worth nearly £3. And he said he could do that because Roger was his born serf. The word used is nativus or knave. Roger said that he was free and produced a charter that showed that he held his land as a free tenant, and the case was lost. In other words, his freedom was proved. The king's court had come to his rescue. You can portray peasants as victims of king and barons and rich churchmen, but they gained some skills and confidence from their experience of government, serving on juries and so on. They had some resources to offer a defence. Roger de la Dun, for example, probably employed a lawyer. He had enough money to pay a lawyer to win the case. Don't forget that this is a period, I've emphasised throughout the problem of being people short of money, partly because there was an inflation going on, and this was a period of growth, and the peasants were actually gaining materially. They therefore gained in their resources and in their confidence. What could they do? How could they react to the demands that were being made of them? How could they could find their liberties as they're described in Magna Carta? At the most basic level, they could simply refuse to cooperate, not carry out orders, not pay money, not do work. show, to use a modern word, disrespect to the Lord. If you look at the records of Downton, a manor of the Bishop of Winchester, though of course in Wiltshire, in 1209, you find Ralph Touch and others took wood from the Lord, and they were fined for it. Roger Carter didn't attend the court, along with 5 others. William de Witton did bad ploughing. Others did not do their harvest work. And William Switting was simply fined for contradiction, which I think is the early 13th century word for disrespect. He dissed his Lord. They didn't achieve a great deal by this. They had to pay fines to the court, and they were quite high fines, 6pence, up to 2 shillings, which is a lot of money in the early 13th century. A more skillful, a more efficient way to advance themselves was to take advantage of their role in the Lord's court, where they filled many important roles as jurors and so on, to protect their interests. Just to give you one small example, if you look at the estates of the bishops of Winchester, you find that the fines that people were paying, the amercements, you remember we looked at earlier, these were being set at 6pence or more in the early 13th century. They'd gone down to 2pence to 4pence at the end of the 13th century. And people have naively said, oh, that shows they were getting poorer. I think they were getting more canny. And they were using the office which the Lord had given them of helping to fix the level of fines in order to reduce the burden on their neighbours. I'll pause for a picture just to lighten the burden. This is a scene from the Lambeth Bible, 12th century illuminated text of the Bible, showing a harvest scene. Of course, it's illustrating the book of Ruth, and that's Ruth, making a rather colourful, well-dressed peasant woman who's gleaning, collecting corn that's been left in the field, and that's Boaz having a conversation with the harvest workers there. But of course the harvest workers are portrayed as 12th century peasants. So as I complete my talk, you can look at that and you can think, well, they're real people, and they, wore rather colourful clothes and they worked hard. There's a story there in that picture. I've been talking about what they could do. They could disrespect the Lord, they could not do their services, they could manipulate the court in favour of them. Another thing they could do was to take direct action. One thing that lords were doing in the 13th century was to seize bits of the common pasture, enclose it and use it for their own purposes, or to rent it out to new tenants. And of course that was bad news for the people who wanted to graze their animals on that particular piece of land. And you get a whole string of cases. Just to pick out one example, in 1276 the abbot of Glastonbury complained that Thomas de Bowes and 10 other men at a place called Nyland in Somerset attacked a bank or dyke that the abbot had built. In fact, he was building a canal to bring boatloads of stone to build the abbey. And they took spades presumably and picks, they threw down 700 yards of bank. 11 people are named in the legal document. I suspect it took rather more than 11 people to demolish 700 yards of substantial earthwork. Perhaps they couldn't identify most of them because they did it in the dark when they were disguised and so on. But why did they do it? Because the bank blocked access to a valuable common pasture. The abbot's works that were beneficial to the monastery were against the interests of the local community. They could petition their lord. like the tenants of Bocking in Essex in 1300, who again employed a lawyer to compose a complaint against the tyranny of a steward. And as one of their arguments, they invoked Magna Carta. That's the first example of Magna Carta explicitly being invoked by peasants in their negotiations with lords. They negotiated with their lords. You can see this in the surveys that many lords produced in the early 13th century. The famous Doomsday of St. Paul's in 1222, for example, which includes statements which show that the local jury was arguing with their monastic lord and persuading them to grant certain benefits and privileges. There was a dispute about whether tenants could take timber from the lord's wood to repair their carts. And after this is described, the survey says, the jurors say that they ought to have it. In other words, the information in the survey was coming from a jury of local people, and they could argue their case. Indeed, there is a result of a negotiation, a charter which I always call a peasant version of Magna Carta, issued in about 1275 at the manor of Holcombe in Norfolk, when a lord, a minor gentry lord, Thomas de Akeley, grants to his tenants a charter confirming their rents, restricting his own rights to tax them, and releasing them from the obligation to use his mill. And another way in which they could bring legal action against their lord was, if their negotiations failed, was for unfree tenants to club together, hire a lawyer, and bring a case in the royal courts, alleging that they had once been tenants of the king, and that this protected them from their lord. One of the earliest cases from the 1230s involves men from Crondall, Hurstbourne priors and Whitchurch in Hampshire, who alleged that the monks of St Swithin's were demanding from them more ploughing services than they were accustomed to do. And they said that they had once been tenants of the king, and it was later found that the manor had not been in the king's hands since about 900. This is in 1230. So either they had incredibly long memories, or someone had done some research in the monastic archive and had found this prior history of ownership by the king. I'm going to end in a couple of minutes. Historians who study baronial politics in the 13th century can generalize about the aims of their great lords. They supported a monarchy, but with limited powers. Kings ought not to make arbitrary demands, but should preside over a fair legal system. This is what Magna Carta is about. A good king would consult them, and consult the barons on important matters, call on their help, but leave them alone as much as possible. What did peasants want in the 13th century? If you look at all these cases of action, of what they do in the courts, the legal cases they bring and so on, you can begin to see something of their psychology, although they've left us no records of their own. They were in favour of good kings. They respected monarchy and expected to be protected from their lords by the king. They saw that private rights to oppress them could only be curtailed by a powerful higher authority. And indeed that was borne out by events in the 14th and 15th centuries. They may even have looked back to a golden age, perhaps in the 12th century, perhaps even much earlier, when kings had been their rulers and they had enjoyed prosperity under the rule of the king. In the short term, they wanted certainty, stability, defined customs, no scope for sudden unexpected demands. They hoped for universal freedom. no bondage, the removal of bad customs like marriage fines and the tax called tallage. They respected written documents. There's a story that peasants hated documents and used to burn them, but that isn't what the records say.